clock says noon, so I guess we needed some catchy music, but I won't fill that in for you. But anyway, again, I'd like to welcome everybody. This is our first ever virtual field day here at the Southern Research and Outreach Center in Waseca. I'm Liz Stahl, a regional extension educator, work normally out of the Worthington Regional Extension Office. And just a few housekeeping things. We'll have 4 speakers today. So they'll speak about 10 minutes or so and then have about 5 minutes of questions for a total of 15 minutes on each. So if you do have any questions, if you hover on the bottom part of your screen, that's that Q&A box. If you click on that, you should pop up that. You can enter any questions there. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please enter those in the chat. With that, we will, again, I have a note there too that this will be recorded. So with that, I will turn this over to Jeff. And again, if you have any questions, please enter those. But again, we have Jeff Vetsch will be our first speaker.
Thanks, Liz, and welcome everyone. My presentation today is combining 4R nutrient management and ecological intensification to advance corn production. And I want to recognize Jeff Coulter, who is the lead PI on this project. Our treatments in this study are pretty simple. We've got intensive agronomics using ecological intensification and comparing that to normal agronomics. And within those two, we have standard fertilizer management and advanced fertilizer management, both of which use some aspects of the 4Rs. These are systems treatments. They were developed at the start of the project. We changed them a little bit due to input from crop advisors, ag agronomists, and farmers in the 2018 growing season. And I will talk about the treatments for the last 3 years from 2018 on. So at Waseca, our agronomic treatments, the normal is a hybrid of about 101 maturity, seeded at 36,000 plants with a designated, or seeds with an ideal or optimal population or target population of 34,000 and no fungicide at tasseling. Our intensive agronomic treatment has 40% of the stover harvested every fall prior to the next growing season. It has a 105 maturity hybrid and a hybrid that can tolerate high populations. It's seeded at 41,000 with a final population, desired population around 39,000. And we include a fungicide at tasseling. And the fungicide treatment was added in 2018. From a fertilizer perspective, the standard treatments pretty much follow U of M guidelines. We have a base rate of sulfur, we have P and K at U of M guidelines, and the phosphorus soil test at this site was very high initially, so all we're applying is starter at 16 pounds of P2O5 per acre. The potassium soil test was high, so we're broadcasting 30 pounds of K2O per acre every year. It gets a starter application, and the nitrogen is applied pre-plant as urea and a total N rate of 180 pounds. Compare that to the advanced fertilizer management, and we use grain removal for P and K, but in 2018 we reduced the phosphorus removal to only 50% of grain removal instead of 100%, and I'll discuss that a bit more a little later. Again, we have starter, but we also have a surface band application, a 2x0 surface band of 7 gallons of UAN and 7 gallons of ATS. And this study came from work that we had done here in the past that showed that those treatments were advantageous for getting early growth and vigor in continuous corn. The other big change is the nitrogen management. We're using 3 applications. We have some at planting, we have pre-plant, and we actually have some at V6 and at V14 as listed here. And the big thing is the total that now exceeds the 180 and is actually 220 pounds of N per acre. And that was based on input from retailers, input from crop consultants, and my own experiences in the last several years where we seem to have need more N on corn after corn than our maximum of our recommended range, which is around 180 with the 0.1 ratio. So what was the effects of using crop removal rates on soil test phosphorus, Bray phosphorus during this study? This is showed in the line at the top, the diamonds or the triangles. You could see during the first 5 years of this study how the soil test phosphorus increased pretty dramatically using crop removal rates compared to the standard fertilizer management, which received starter only and saw a slight decline, which is understandable. The soil test initiated around 23 part per million. Is this sustainable over a long period of time? This is one of the questions that we have in the study, and eventually, obviously, we would have to broadcast some phosphorus in the standard practice. But this large, rapid increase in the advance was the reason for reducing the crop removal to only 50%. That and the economic impact, which we'll get into in a moment. From a soil test potassium standpoint, the standard practice is the circles at the bottom, the advanced is the triangles. You can see they mirror each other from sampling from year to year quite well, with the advanced being significantly greater. And it received about a little bit more than 2 times the amount of K that the standard treatment did. These are pictures from the study taken last week, and the treatments are above the picture, and I'll just kind of highlight the key things that you can see in these photos. I think the top 2 photos are normal agronomics, and the things that you can really see is the greater residue cover on the soil surface. And that's compared to the bottom 2 pictures, which is intensive agronomics, where we have the 40% residue removal. And that's been a big factor in this study. And certainly in long-term continuous corn, is that sustainable? That's one of the questions, and we have a lot of other soil physical property measurements that will address those questions with. On the right side of the screen, the pictures on the right, these are the treatments that received advanced fertilizer management. And in general, you can see that they have a little taller plants, they have more leaf area index, and this is consistent with findings we've had from the previous years at both locations. And it's driven by that surface band application of UAN and ATS at planting, getting us greater early growth and vigor in this continuous corn system. We'll talk a little bit about yields, and this is at Waseca, and the yield gap from our poorest treatment to our best treatment each year is one of the things what we're paying attention to. The yield gap has ranged from 16 to 64 bushels per acre. It's averaged 31 bushels. The greatest yields have been achieved with intensive agronomics and advanced fertilizer management, not only in each year as the shaded numbers show, but also averaged over the 7 years. The decent yields or moderate yields have been obtained with either intensive agronomics with standard management or normal agronomics with advanced management. Especially in the last 2 years, the normal and advanced has been fairly competitive. When we get into the economics, you'll see some of the economic factors and how that drives these treatments, and we're not just paying attention to yield. 2014 was a particularly poor year at this site. When you look at the variability as in advancing fertilizer management or intensifying, does that minimize the amount of variability that we see from year to year? Yes, if you include 2014 in this data set, but if you take it out, there really is no difference. So that year was kind of an anomaly, and it was driven by a very wet spring, a lot of denitrification and loss, and we probably needed more adaptive management to address our nitrogen concerns in 2014, and that was what drove our yields pretty low in the standard treatments. I won't spend a lot of time looking at the individual variable costs for each item that we included, but you see there's a long list here. And at the bottom, the range was from $212 per acre to as much as $344 per acre. So quite a change in the input costs. And then at the very bottom, highlighted in dark and underlined, this was the first year that Jeff worked with an economist at the U of M to look at the value of the stover. They calculated the 40% removal to be about 2.7 bales, and the value of that, if sold, to be about $95. So you'll see that has a pretty significant effect on their economics when we look at the intensive management where we had the value of that stover. Here's the net returns from our variable costs, with all other costs just being considered equal. The greatest net return in all years and on average was with intensive agronomics and standard fertilizer management at Waseca. And it was significantly greater than normal and advanced, in excess of 300 or 130, $45 approximately. In the last 2 years, some of the other treatments have been more competitive, especially the advanced fertilizer management was only $23 to $30 less than with standard fertilizer management in recent years. And that's driven by the fact that we reduced those that phosphorus from 100% of crop removal to 50%. That additional cost was affecting the advanced nutrient management and hurting its yield potential or its economic potential return on investment. We'll move to the Becker site and irrigated sand. Again, just the normal is a 96-day maturity hybrid at 36,000, the intensive being 103 at 41,000 seeds. Partial stover removal was done in the first 3 years of the study, but had to be discontinued in 2017 when the Becker site was lost and had to be moved, and we had some logistical issues with finding someone to do that for us. From a fertilizer management standpoint, the standard and advanced, really major differences from a Becker site to the Waseca site is in nitrogen management. Again, we've got the common practice or historical practice for these irrigated sands would be to put on a starter rate of N at V2 and then side dress the rest at V6. And the advanced practice, we looked at 4 applications or splitting it over 4 different times from V2, V6, V12, and putting some on at VT. But the total N rates are the same. And this came from data from John Lamb and others that showed that this was a superior N application method in these irrigated sands, especially in these wetter years, which have been more common recently. And even though we call that the advanced practice, I would say at this point, it's pretty much a standard protocol for most of those growers. We look at the yield gap at Becker. It ranged from 14 to 59 bushels. It averaged 42 bushels. In general, I think our yields at Becker were a little disappointing, less than we expected. We expected to be in the mid or at least 220 to 250 range, and we could not consistently stay there. The greatest yields were with advanced fertilizer management and intensive agronomics, both among years and across years. The advanced fertilizer management was probably the big driving factor, and I think it goes to that 4-way split of nitrogen as having a big impact as compared to only having a 2-way split. When we look at the economics, we're looking at intensive standard and intensive advanced having the advantage over the other treatments. To summarize, the study was initiated with 10 years. It's concluding here at Waseca in 2020. Becker, we had to conclude last year due to funding. Current yield levels are less than our potential. We've had difficult weather years, especially 2014 at Waseca. We found a significant yield gap among treatments, 40+ bushels in some years. The standard nutrient management, which primarily was U of M recommendations, did reduce yields in some years at both locations. Profitability, the intensive agronomics, or the value of the corn stover has made a big influence and has favored that intensive agronomics. From a fertilizer management standpoint and profitability, nitrogen and phosphorus have been the most important parts at Waseca. The additional N, I think, and the split applications at Waseca of nitrogen compared to reducing the amount of phosphorus or using the crop removal phosphorus was too much and was too expensive at Waseca. And at Becker, it was driven primarily by nitrogen and nitrogen management. I'd like to acknowledge all the funding sources and collaborators, and with that, we'll take any questions.
Sorry, I didn't have myself on mute. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. We do have a question here. Question is, were the soil tests for P and K taken at the same time each year? Because you see the K values went up and down, so just wondering what caused this.
Yeah, so that's a good question. The soil samples were always taken post-harvest, typically late October or maybe early November. But yeah, generally the same time of the year. The K soil test did go up and down, and I noticed that as well. And that's not too unusual in glacial till soils. We've seen that in some of our other potassium studies. What causes it? It can be a number of factors. The soil moisture status of the soil at the time of sampling, that can drive it. The amount of drying of the samples that needs to be done. If the samples are really wet, that can affect it a little bit. And then the amount of K that's leached out of the residue and back into the field at the time of sampling and how fast that happens can also influence it.
Okay, all right, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's a little bit different when we can't like see the plots, but it's nice you have some pictures, and we can also see some different sites that you had too, which we normally couldn't do if we were on one hay rack, right? But
And the dew
um,
point isn't 75. It's comfortable where I'm at.
that is true. All right. Well, with that, we are at our cutoff time here. And again, I think, again, we'll end formally at 1, but if people do think of questions later, I think most of our speakers are going to be available to hang around if people want to do that later, because we are on such a tight timeline here. But anyway, I will go ahead and Dan, if you want to start loading up your talk, introduce Dan Kaiser. He's our extension specialist in nutrient management, and is going to talk about sulfur fertilization of corn in southern Minnesota. So, and again, if you do have questions, feel free to enter those in that Q&A box. And Dan, you are muted yet.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep, and can see your
Okay.
screen and hear you.
All right. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is some of the work we have currently ongoing at Waseca, looking at sulfur fertilization. Looking at my research over the last 10 years, I think we've done a very good job establishing the overall benefit of sulfur. What a lot of my current work has been doing has been looking at fine-tuning at least some of the sources and timings, just to see what options growers have, and particularly looking at elemental sulfur. That was one of the key points I wanted to look at with some of my newer studies, to see what's the best option for managing that nutrient within a corn cropping system. One of the issues, if we look at a lot of our research, most of it's been conducted in a single location for 1 year. And with elemental sulfur, that's been one of the things that's been in the back of my mind for about the last 5 years, is that if we know we have issues with oxidation of that product, that potentially we could use longer studies within a given location to start looking at benefits further down the line. The other issue that we've been seeing too is that when we apply commercial phosphorus fertilizer products, particularly dry sources, MAP, DAP, triple super phosphate to eliminate the chance of phosphorus limiting yield, that these products also still contain a small amount of sulfur within themselves, between 1% to 3%. So that was the other thing that's been, when I look at a lot of my data, is we see very small yield responses to very small rate of sulfur. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of that sulfur that's in with the phosphorus sources itself. And then the other thing has been just looking at how we assess carryover. And soil tests themselves, I'm not going to really get into that in this presentation, but they are not a very good indicator of sulfur availability, particularly the ones that we use. And I haven't found anything that's better out there that shows what sulfur is doing on a year-to-year basis that really can differentiate between treatments within the field long-term for some of the studies. So back in 2019, we had some funding from AFRIC to establish a series of long-term sulfur trials. These trials were going to be in continuous corn because I wanted a cropping rotation that was going to be what I felt was going to be more responsive to sulfur. We're looking at 3 rates, so a very low rate of 5 and 10, which would be kind of my target recommendation for most growers, and then also a higher rate of 20 pounds. And in these sites, as I said before, we've been trying to eliminate the need to broadcast phosphorus. So we're looking at high soil testing situations, banded fertilizer with liquids to try to eliminate some of that sulfur contamination, to start teasing out some of the effects, particularly with situations where we may only need 5 pounds of sulfur, and we have a very, very low need there. The sources that we're using, potassium sulfate, I was trying to eliminate the need for ammonium sulfate because it's balancing becomes more of a challenge. Then we're using 2 elemental sulfur products. One is this MST product, this micronized sulfur technology that's being researched by Sulfur Incorporated, which is a company out of Canada. It's a 15% sulfur product. It's 100% elemental that's ground down to a fine size of 10 microns. And with elemental sulfur, one thing with release or oxidation of that product, the smaller the particle size, generally the better we're going to have in terms of getting that product available for a given crop. Then comparing that with a Tiger 90, which is around, from what I could read, around 60 microns. So it's going to be a more coarser particle size. Higher analysis products, when we start looking at the total amount of product we're applying, it's going to be much less with that Tiger 90, just because of the 90% S concentrations, which could have some implications in terms of distribution of sulfur across the landscape. So I just want to show you a picture of some of the trials we have out there. This is actually last week at Waseca. You can kind of see the yellowing areas, which are areas with no sulfur, or our Tiger 90 plots. These have been showing up in 2019. We could see these as well, particularly the controls and the Tiger 90s were both showing some sulfur stress through the most of the season. I put this dividing line in here. This is just kind of the difference between where we have 10 pounds and 20 pounds of sulfur, because I want to talk about this a little bit further, because we are seeing what I feel to be some carryover impacts from some of these treatments from the last year's application. And you see within the 10-pound rate, we see the MST here in the back, the sulfate, both fairly green. The sulfate showing a better growth within this particular location than the Tiger 90, and then the NOS seeing that much smaller and seeing some visible sulfur deficiencies if we could zoom in on these locations. The interesting thing, though, that I'm seeing, 20 pounds, you can see that Tiger 90 being a lot greener within that particular area of the field. And this, again, was one of the reasons why we wanted to look at some of those higher rates to see whether or not that those higher rates were needed potentially with an elemental sulfur product that we're seeing less efficiency just because of lower oxidation potential of that product itself. These are just looking at some of the growth. We did some measurements with an active sensor. Just kind of a couple things out of this I just want to highlight. If you look at the sulfate and the MST, you're seeing, again, much higher growth. If we look at our different rates of sulfur, 5, 10, and 20, this is our control seeing for growth, which was expected. The main thing looking here is that we look at this this Tiger 90, seeing that it is increasing growth, so we are seeing some benefit of that product. But you look at overall efficiency of that product related to sulfate, it's working at about the sulfate's about 4 to 1 in terms of the overall growth potential when it comes to the rate of sulfur being applied within the field. So again, we're seeing some issues with it, with the Tiger 90, where it's less efficient at this given location. I wanted to throw Rosemont in there just as a comparison. It's been interesting, actually, these MST products, which I expected to have less availability of the sulfur. We are seeing some benefit from them. You see these letters indicate significance where we're seeing the MST seeing much greater growth in 2020, seeing slightly less with the sulfate. Tiger 90 seeing something, but not quite as much. And then again here, the no sulfur controls, seeing that being the smallest growth as possible. So it is interesting. We're seeing some effect of the Tiger 90. I think looking at it as we go forward with this was one of the reasons we wanted to go with a longer term study to see if we're building sulfate over time, which we may indeed be doing with some of these treatments as we go along. Just throwing some yield data out there. This is from last year. Just looking at Rosemont, again, seeing sulfate or potassium sulfate, the highest yield. Seeing the similar with the MST product, Tiger 90, a small yield bump, but they're not as high as the other two. And again, looking at about a 13 bushel yield reduction without sulfur at that given location. Waseca is seeing a stronger yield increase and actually seeing some of that, the elemental sulfur product, these co-granulated products, seeing actually a greater benefit. And we'll see if this carries through to 2020, because a lot of the things we saw in 2019 with growth are the same things that we're seeing this year. It was interesting that that the elemental sulfur product out-yielded the sulfate. So looking at maybe some loss of that sulfate with the rainfall we had at Waseca in 2020. One of the other things I'm doing, we're looking at some ion probes. I'm not going to talk too much about that. This is another way that we can track availability. These little orange probes are measuring the amount of sulfate released, which would potentially indicate sulfate available to the corn root over the growing season. Looking at tracking the data itself, it kind of interesting with the Tiger 90. The only site we actually saw it in terms of availability be higher coarse textured soils, and majority of the other sites seeing very little of that product, where it looks like it was becoming available with these ion probes, seeing a much greater availability of sulfate and that smaller, more finely ground sulfate material within those given fields. And then just Rosemont as comparison, we're seeing again MST. We're seeing just in that upper surface, seeing it hanging around longer, seeing some greater movement potential as we expected from sulfate within the given year. So we are looking at these same things again this year. And one of the things I'm interested to see if these Tiger 90 treatments are slightly elevated, where we're picking up potentially some sulfur or that's being oxidized from that application from 2019. So that was kind of the reasoning behind this, at least, is to look at again the long-term approach and seeing what we can get with these products over time. Timing itself, it just depends on the year. I haven't really been hesitant for growers wanting to fall apply. One of the main things that we need to really look at source, and that's again kind of one of the reasonings behind some of these studies we're doing now is just to look at that timing by source interaction, just to see what's the best option moving forward. Because we have years where fall application with sulfate works, but we also have years that where it doesn't work, and it really depends on the rainfall situation. So that's one of the things I think time will tell, and it's one of the things that we've been working for in particular is looking at weaving some of these things in with our recommendations. So Liz, that's all I have. Is there any time for any questions?
Yep, we have time for some questions here. Again, reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to enter those in that Q&A box. And I guess I just have a general one too, Dan. If people are interested in, just kind of what our general recommendations are for amount of sulfur to apply, where would they find that? I mean, do you have any general comments about that? Does that differ for corn following corn versus corn following soybeans? If you just wanted to comment on that a little bit.
We did go in the spring and I did do some updates to some of our recommendation tables. The main update that I made was looking at clarifying some of our recommendations for situations where corn followed soybean, because we're seeing, particularly in that Waseca area, we're seeing more of a benefit for corn following soybean with a sulfur application, even with the high organic matter soils that are at those given locations. So that is online right now with the revision. I need to get a news release out just talking a little bit more about that. We always had that in the publication. I would made it more clear. Rate-wise, 10 to 15 pounds can do a lot. One of the things, though, as I said, looking at that elemental sulfur, particularly with the Tiger 90, you may be looking at upping that rate. And that's one of the things that I did not have built into the recommendation. Our recommendation was almost specifically related to sulfate forms. So that's one of the things I think with this newer work we'll be looking at, because looking at some of the higher rates, I know I hear growers applying, it may be, I think, warranted, particularly with if you're using something like a Tiger 90 product or a bentonite elemental sulfur product, just because of the overall availability. So the recommendations, we do recommend higher. If you're below 2% organic matter, you want to crank the rate up a little bit. I'd be looking at probably 15 to 20 pounds, but for the most part, if you're in around that 3% organic matter in the top 6 inches, 10, 15 pounds is plenty for most of the situations that we've seen.
Okay, thanks. And again, those are available through our Extension Crops website. You can get on the nutrient management site, and that is just z.umn.edu/crops. I do have that in the chat there as well to find that information. But we do have a question here too. Scott asks, so how about if you have manure on the corn acres, do you need sulfate with that? Would those recommendations change any in that situation?
That's a good question. And I've had some consultants debate me a little bit on the need for sulfur. I think if you're dealing with some of the central Minnesota, the wetter, heavier soils, if you're dealing with liquid swine manure, I think there's probably going to be a call maybe for a small between 5-10 pounds just to kind of get you through the early part of the growing season. I know that's where a lot of the consultants, the discussion was, particularly those that were managing liquid swine manure. If you get like beef pack, kind of more of a dry source, I don't think you're going to need quite as much. But I mean, 1-2 gallons of ammonium thiosulfate, if you can put that on the soil surface to the side of the row, that tends to be enough really to kind of get you through some of those situations where you have issues. With manure, what we typically say is about 65% of the total should be available. But that's only been kind of partially researched, and I kind of wonder, particularly with some of the pit manures, what that availability is. They might actually be slightly less than that. So I would say looking at the field, you're not going to need a lot, but you may want to look at if you are putting some UAN on with, particularly plowed on with herbicide, you could look at putting a small rate of ATS in, or if you're doing an early side dress, putting a gallon or 2 of ATS, and it isn't necessarily a bad option.
Okay, all right, thanks, Dan. Okay, then we will we'll go wheel the hay rack over to the weed management trials now, Tom. And do you want to, yep, got your stuff loaded up. So got to have Tom Hoverstad talk about corn and soybean weed control, look at the 2020 research plots.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you. Nice when we can get back out, but we'll take a look at what we saw this year. I think we can learn a few things like we do every year. And I'd like to talk about the weed trials. We do these across the state. I work with a group of university personnel that have trials, and we're going to take a quick look at the Waseca plots to see what they show this year. And I'm going to start with corn treatments, talking about, we do corn and soybeans at the Waseca station here, concentrate pretty heavily on what the industry puts out for you. And I'll spend a minute or two talking about one thing that we've always tried to, the goal would be to get one pass broadleaf and grass control in corn. And I've been doing this nearly 40 years now, and it's nigh impossible to really get satisfactory control of both in one pass, especially in our weed area where I think you could see from the previous picture, we try to leave a few weeds go so we have a good weed pressure in there. But in my career, Acuron has come along and probably been the most impressive as a product that can maybe do that, provide season-long grass control. And early on in the season here, I'm showing my ratings. I think you'll find that that's pretty good. And oftentimes that product has a chance to hold for the season. If anything does break, it's usually grass control. And I think there's 3 other entries into that one pass grass and broadleaf weed control, being Anthemax, Corvus and Atrazine. Resicor looks pretty good this year too. The way things work this year, the soil applied products worked very well. We had good crop growth, good soil moisture, and the performance of these products was very good. I think you can see another thing we can do to clean up some of the grass control. I'm going to show these plots quickly. This happens to be Acuron. Pretty good looking this year. If anything does break, it's going to be grasses. And the next slide is Anthemax. I think you're going to see that's disappointing grass control, but that's not anymore a disaster because we have post-emergence options. Now, this is a planned one-pass program. We're going to leave this go. We will have comparisons where we clean that up with some other treatments, but that's the one that usually causes problems in corn is grass control. This happens to be the Corvus, and then Resicor looked pretty good this year. So I've got each of them, and we'll see what they provide season long. But as I mentioned, grass control is the thing, and Roundup makes a nice backup for that. You know, we've used a lot of glyphosate over the years in corn and soybeans, and we've learned what it can and can't do. But still, it is a pretty safe, economical, and effective grass control product. And here, I wasn't the only one who thought of it. The industry came to us with Anthemax, Callisto, and Atrazine. They said, well, we'll follow that up with post-emergence Roundup. My early ratings show that the Roundup probably hasn't completely controlled the grass yet, but I really like to look at the final ratings when I'm talking about that. Another thing I wanted to share with you, we don't have a lot of, well, we don't have any new chemistry out there. Occasionally some new products come out, and this is one from Amvac, Cinnate. It's, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's a premix of the active ingredient in Impact premixed with the active ingredient in Liberty, which is glufosinate. So I think it's pretty aptly named, Cinnate. Should be a good reminder for you that if you're going to use that product, you have to have glufosinate tolerant corn. So that's for Liberty Link corn. That's one new thing that came out this year that we're looking at in our trials. Along the lines of talking about sharpening up grass control with glyphosate, here's another trial. This is Impact Core. Amvac is looking at Impact premixed with acetochlor, the active ingredient in harness, as a product to give Impact probably some more soil residual. As you can see, Impact is one of those that really whitens some of the weeds. I don't think it's going to be that strong on grasses, so I think some of those will escape, even though you see quite a bit of activity. But take a look at what happened when we tank mix Roundup with that. Really sharpens up grass control, and that's a pretty safe and economical way to do that. Soybeans. Thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about what we look at in soybeans, and we're really trying to get information on how we should be attacking the weed population in soybeans that we have to deal with. And really, soil applied products have become much more of a player in the soybean arena. Water hemp's been a big issue, and we really have to attack that soil applied for a number of reasons, and I'll kind of go over many of them. But here's our trials when we're trying to look at a host of those, not necessarily a completely exhaustive list, but we had Authority First, Surveil, Fierce MTZ, Zidua Pro, Warrant Ultra as soil applied. And this is my rating before any of the post-emergence work was done. And you'll see we don't often really think of these as season-long grass control products. And like we can do in corn, we can clean up grasses fairly easily in soybeans. So we don't worry about that. We kind of try to hone in on what's working with our target broadleaf weeds. And in this case, I have the second weed here is common ragweed. I got a pretty good population of that. And I'm usually Authority First is the premier product on that, but for whatever reason, we didn't see as good a numbers on that. And Fierce and Zidua Pro seem to be a little bit better. Year in and year out, anything with the active ingredient in first rate, which Authority First has, is our premier common ragweed product. So that's a bit of an anomaly that I've seen this year. Now, take those products that we soil apply and then follow them. Here we've followed them in the Extend package. We had Ingenia Roundup post-emergence. We can certainly clean up those grasses, and very good broadleaf scores on that. The end of the season is a little more indicative of what might escape through that. Sometimes we do have some late emerging weeds that cause more problems, but this site, because I have always let a few weed escapes, it's sort of a weed refuge. We haven't really morphed into a solid water hemp site like a lot of fields have. So I'll occasionally get a good look at what escapes, but we're not going to see the water hemp disasters that you often see in fields. So that's following those products with either Ingenia. We follow the same ones with the Enlist program, which has 2,4-D instead of the dicamba product. Similar, and I think I can show you some of our plots later on, but I've got some thoughts about how we can do that. Here's soil applied Authority First. And I think that's what we would expect. You see quite a few weeds in there, particularly mostly grasses coming through there. But when we follow that up, this would be the Ingenia or the Extend portion of the field, or follow it up with the Enlist program. We pretty well cleaned up those, and that's what a lot of our farmers have adopted is putting on something soil applied. And whether you're in the Extend or Enlist, even just regular glyphosate tolerant. And we also keep a program in there for the conventional people. We've got high oleic beans and things like that. So we still look at those treatments in our weed plots. I wanted to share one thing. Now, I've always been in this a long time, and every year I say, well, I've never seen that before. I've never seen a June that is as windy as this one was before. And you can look at this in the Minnesota Crop News. It's a nice little piece that Jared Goplin and Dave Nicolai put together, talking about just how hard it was to get some of our spraying done this year. And they've got some charts in there that look at how many hours you could spray. And they're specifically kind of targeting the dicamba system, and I kind of will too, but Waseca County here in the first 15 days in June, probably 40, maybe 50 hours to get those applications done. So I looked at our own data. We've got a weather station here. I have to thank Jeff Vetsch and his crew, Kyle and those guys. They take care of all the equipment. They collect the data, but I'm the one that gets to use it. So I'm kind of lucky in that situation. I grabbed all their data and I just went through, like this happens to be June 11th. Hourly weather data. A column here with wind speed, max wind speed. We don't have minimum wind speed, but we had maximum wind speed. And this was typical. I mean, quite a while. And I just made the assumption. I said, well, from 7 in the morning till about 8 at night is when we can apply dicamba. How many hours did I have on this day to do that? And well, it was only the last 2 hours. So 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. I probably could safely apply dicamba. That's on June 11th. I went through all days leading up to June 20th, which is the last day we can use that. And we were running into a lot of trouble. And I was in our plots too. I've got dicamba to put on. And here it is, June 15th. I need to get it done by the 20th. And it's windy. I believe I went out there on the 18th and got those done. Or maybe it was the 19th. I can't remember for sure. But finally, the last few days, the wind did calm down and we could get some of those applications done. But boy, we had a limited time to do that. Now, you might think I'm telling you this as some sort of a way to steer you away from the dicamba system, but I'm not. I really feel that that system has a place. Here's a plot that I think, and Iowa State came up with this right away. They were touting Ingenia or dicamba as a soil applied product for soybeans. And I think that really has a lot of merit. For a couple of reasons, it targets the weeds it's strong on. I think giant ragweed is one of its strengths. It's an early emerger. I don't think it's going to be a late savior treatment in soybeans. It's just not going to work out that way. But here's an economical one. Early post tank mix Ingenia Pro, which has some soil residual zidua with it. I think this probably is the economical way. One pass, I probably would be better off maybe splitting that because I think you can see some grass escapes in there. Another thing we're looking at, this came from BASF also, they have Ingenia Prime, which has dicamba, it's got pursuit, and it's got a little stiffer rate of zidua in it. Look at that pre-emergence, and then if conditions do work out, you can apply Ingenia again. And in this case, I made sure they did, and I got that done by June 20th. So that does look pretty good. I wanted to leave you with a couple of things. I just went out and snapped some pictures yesterday. And I think in the upper left here, you can see this is Flexstar on a soybean trial, and Flexstar misses lamb's quarters. And that's going to happen to anybody. Lamb's quarter is a very common weed. If we design a program and forget about lamb's quarter, it will come back to bite you. And as a reminder, here's pretty large water hemp. This is Flexstar. This is Liberty on large water hemp. My point is we still don't have an answer for escaped water hemp in soybeans. We'd sure like to have one, but we just don't seem to have that. That'll be the next thing we'll try to work on. I can take some questions. I want to leave you with this picture. We took this morning, corn knee high by the 4th of July. Now we're not going to be on any NBA roster, the three of us that were out there. That's a couple of agronomy crew with me and that corn, but we're not dwarves either. That corn's over our heads. So things are looking pretty good this year. Do we have time for a question or two? And
sure. Yep. Thanks, Tom. And yeah, I see a comment. Yeah, just the way the presentations ended up being a little hard to see some of the captions on the slides, but maybe we can get that fixed up for what we get posted online. But I do have one question here, just like your input on that a half rate of pre with a half rate at post versus a full rate of pre. You know, so that would be, yeah, I'll let you
comment. A lot of that. We did a lot of half rate pre followed whatever products. And I think we've learned that we've run into trouble. Using those half rates, we often allow, it seems to foster resistance faster using those half rates. I think it's time that we look at our weed spectrum, know what weeds you're after, and if you're going after it soil applied, give it a lethal dose of that product, because using those half rates, we've run into trouble in the past. And I think it's time to focus in on a weed and really try to get two modes of action that really work on that weed and give it a lethal dose of both. I think that's where we're going to see our most success.
Yep, and that would be in contrast to a full rate pre and then followed by that 30 days after planting, you know, another full rate depending on what your max rate is on the label. So that would be what, you know, would be the recommendation to help combat resistance issues and get better weed control. But we do have one more quick question here. Any comments on crops underwater from heavy rains?
Oh yeah, we did get some ponding. We had 2.5 inches of rain this week. I know some areas had 5. It's kind of a wait and see. The corn is tall enough. Usually most of it sticks out of water. Talked to Dan and Jeff a little bit about how much nitrogen we might lose in that, but at these temperatures, crops underwater, boy, 24 hours to crops can tolerate being underwater when it's cool, but boy, when it's warm like this, and we've had 70-degree nights, it's not going to take long. Fortunately, most of that water fell on areas where a lot of it runs away. We only had 2.5 inches, which was plenty. I do have ponds out here, but seems to me the 5 and 6 inch amounts kind of fell on this in the southeast area where you have some rolling topography, and some of that water may have drained away.
Yep, and we do have a Minnesota Crop News article on that issue, you know, and we have some links on there too if you are interested in finding more about that. But all right, well, thank you, Tom. We'll turn it over.
Release, you can click on it, and I linked it to that Minnesota Crop News release. So that's good information. I looked at that; it was very helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. All right, well, we will switch it over to our next, last but not least, right, Greg? Gregg Johnson, also at the Southern Research and Outreach Center here, is going to talk about cover crop research. He's got a number of different projects going on. So.
All right, thanks, Liz. So on this last presentation here, I just simply wanted to give everyone a sense of the types of the projects that are going on around cover crops. You know, as we're all well aware, this has been around for a long time. We've seen a lot of successes. We've also seen a lot of failures. Part of what we are charged with doing at the university is to understand what is driving these successes and failures and how to use that information then to design cover systems that reduce risk as much as possible. So that's our goal. And I wanted to step through a couple projects that are ongoing here at the SROC around some of those key concepts. Now, I will not be talking about oilseed cover crops. I'm going to confine the discussion to conventional cover crops. The oilseed cover crops are especially relevant right now. They're very important, but that's for another day and time. That work is being charged by Scotty Wells and others up at the U of M. We do have some work on oil seeds at the SROC, but again, I'm just going to focus on the covers and what we're doing here. So, why isn't my, there, okay, I guess, sorry. So I'm going to focus on 3 questions given the time that we have today. The first one is dealing with this establishment question. Well, basically the first 2 are all primarily on establishment. The first one has to do with this idea of what we have had a lot of questions about weed control in cover crop systems. And I'm specifically tuned into late emerging weeds such as water hemp. So we asked this question, can we use these long residual pre-herbicides and still plant cover crops? So that was our first question. The second one was having to deal with tillage issues. We've seen a lot of successes associated with tillage systems. So we wanted to get a sense of how the type and the sequence of tillage is influencing cover crop establishment. And then the third one looks specifically at some annual systems rather than the overwintering. and look at how they perform. So the first one, again, is dealing with this question of herbicide use in conjunction with covers. So what we did is we applied a series of herbicides late or early last spring, around May 2nd timeframe. And we applied Reservoir, Verdict, Outlook, and then we used a layered approach to Outlook. So as far as residual, Reservoir with the Callisto or mesotrione is probably our longest lasting one, followed by Verdict and then Outlook. And we went into those different pre-herbicide programs, and we planted cover crops in the fall about mid-September. So again, we wanted to understand, all right, did those long residual herbicides that are designed for water hemp control going to impact our cover crops? And then we were also interested in looking at how those cover crops, if they were dinged up by the pre-herbicides, what was their impact the next spring as far as weed control on the early emerging. So this is some real preliminary data on the biomass that was taken this spring. And you can see on the x-axis there is the herbicides, and then we have biomass accumulation in kilograms per hectare in this particular case. So one thing comes out on these across our 3 locations, Waseca, Rosemount, and Rochester, is that the rye cover crop did the best, followed by camelina and red clover. You know, no surprises, right? What did surprise us, though, was there's essentially no difference in biomass accumulation of these cover crops across these different herbicides. The reason that was a bit surprising to us was that we didn't just randomly choose these locations. Waseca is that heavy clay loam soil. Rosemount is more of a silty loam, and Rochester is more of a sandy loam. So when you're looking at pre's, those are things that do affect residual properties. So really, we didn't see a lot of difference across all these soils as far as their effect on red clover, that were essentially not different from the untreated check. So does this mean now we can apply whatever we want and the cover crops will be fine? Well, let me give you a huge word of caution here. Is number one, this is only 1 year of data. You never base anything on 1 year data. And number two is that when you start dealing with pre-herbicides and residual properties and things like that, soil moisture and temperature become important drivers. So if we look at, if we look at the Reservoir, for example, the mesotrione in there is primarily degraded by microbial processes. So where we have high rainfall, high temperatures, those microbes go to work on that very quickly. So at all 3 locations, very high rainfall and good temperatures, and I think that was the reason that we didn't see any effect. But we'll conduct this trial another year, and we'll see what happens, and we can hopefully build some recommendations. Okay, the second one wanted to talk about briefly is this idea of tillage type and sequence. So you'll get growers that have very long-term successes with these cover crops, and you'll see them experimenting with different tillage systems. They have had poor luck in conventional, so they've changed it up and had some success. So we wanted to sort of take a look at this and see if there's something that we can do to reduce risk or enhance establishment of these cover crops. So we have a study in, this is very, very new study. We don't really have any results yet, but just to give you a sense that we are looking at these different tillage sequences. So we have everything from this very sort of aggressive tillage strategy with, you know, ripping after corn and chisel plow after beans, to all the things in between, to no-till corn, no-till beans. What we're doing with the RIP systems is we are planting the cover crops in September, and then we do our biomass at first frost and then go in there and do the tillage. That's how we're getting away with that one. Within each tillage then, we planted cereal rye, annual rye, and a three-way mix. You know, with regard to corn yield, just looking at the data, it's just overwhelmed by the tillage. So trying to detect differences in cover crops is you know, somewhat difficult, but I don't really expect to see a lot of yield differences with these cover crops, just given the sort of residue or biomass that we had. As far as the cover crops, just visually, I think, as we can all appreciate, as you reduce tillage, you do get more or greater establishment and more biomass. What we're trying to understand best is how much do you have to reduce that to get that effect. So, so that's a trial that we're looking at, and we'll have some results hopefully. We'll run this another year as well and have some results. All right, so the third question here has to do with the type of cover crop. So the strategy, the traditional strategy has been to use, you know, the cereal rye, you know, other crops that overwinter. There's been a lot of interest recently in planting winter-killed cover crops, for example, annual rye. And so the question is, okay, if we plant these winter-killed cover crops, can we get the same benefits that we would from an overwintering cover crop, but not have to deal with all the termination issues? So this is what we're sort of getting at here. And this is a point where we also started doing some work on that nutrient dynamics. So first, this issue of, you know, what does that biomass accumulation look like? And so we did a trial in 17 and 18 where we looked at annual rye with crimson clover, and then we had a three-way mix of annual rye, crimson clover, and forage radish. And we put these cover crops in a conventional no-till and strip-till system. So they're pretty, you know, these are pretty stable systems, and we looked at biomass accumulation. Now this is a busy slide and I don't have time to go into the nuances here, but I wanted to use this to demonstrate a couple things. It's just the year-to-year variability, as I think we've all seen, in how that cover crop performs. Where we have one year where, for example, on the no-till in 2017, that three-way mix outperformed anything else in no-till, but yet we see just the two-way mix performing better. So there's just a lot of variability going on. It becomes very hard to predict. The same thing with the soybeans. So here again, we're planting the cover crops in the soybeans, much less biomass than the corn, and that was just due to establishment issues and trying to get it through that soybean canopy. The other thing is the mineralization. Again, quickly through this. So we took data of mineralization in the spring after that cover crop with the annual rye systems. And again, we had mineralization very, very quickly if there was a difference in the covers, but for the most part, it was gone pretty quickly, and we didn't see any difference between that and the controls. So there's a lot of talk about using covers to sort of extend the availability of nitrogen in the season. We just didn't see that with the annual crops or with the annual rye. All right, real quick through two other slides. So this was a study that Hannah Roche did back in, she finished it up last year, where she sort of tried to combine this idea of annual rye and its comparison to cereal rye in 2 and 3-way mixtures. And just sort of a recap of what she found. We had this site at the Eltarn, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these are long-term plots. And we have a site up in Grand Rapids, believe it or not. And up there, we just didn't see any difference in those different annual rye versus cereal rye, 2-3 mixtures versus monoculture. We really didn't see any canopy cover, biomass, or N content. What was interesting though at Lamberton and Waseca, so the southern locations, is that annual rye systems seem to do quite well as far as capture, cover and biomass accumulation. And they did accumulate more N in the fall than did the cereal systems. And then when we look specifically at the cereal rye, when we go to terminate that in the spring, we just didn't see any differences in canopy cover or anything else between locations, given that monoculture 2 and 3-way interaction. And then the last point for my time is up here is just make you aware that we do have this long-term research networks. We have a site at Waseca, Lamberton, and Grand Rapids, where we are specifically testing the resiliency of crop systems as a function of rotation, but also using cover crops as a way to add diversity into the system. So we have a system looking at rye as the sole cover, and then we have another system number 6, which is looking at a pennycress in corn as not only a cover crop, but also a profit center, the potential for profit on that. So we're looking at that in the long term and looking at how that's affecting soil structure, fertility, growth, all these things. So pay attention to that. So Liz, that's all I wanted to share today.
Okay.
So we can...
All right. Thank you, Greg. And just a reminder, we do have a cover crop field day coming up on August 18th. It'll be another virtual field day. But yeah, Greg will be with that too, and Axel Garcia and myself talking about some of the cover crop work too. So with that, we have gone a little bit over our 1 o'clock time. So again, I just want to make sure I thank everybody for attending today. And again, we'll have recording of this available on the Southern Research and Outreach Center website. Also, you can find that link eventually, probably next week sometime. We'll hopefully try to get that posted on our Extension Crops website. But if you do have some questions, I think, the speakers we're happy to stick around here a little bit, but if you need to go, we understand. So anyway, with that, again, thank you for coming. And I've seen a number of CEU questions. We did not necessarily format this looking at CEUs with the sessions being 15 minutes in each. Usually you have to have a half hour. So you would need to report those. And again, it's not really been formatted for CEUs. I've had a number of those questions just to let you know about that. But anyway, any questions? And thanks for the nice comments. So, all right. I know we had a Liberty discussion going on. Tom, I don't know if you wanted to mention that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I can talk a little. I have quite a bit of experience with Liberty. The gentleman's concern was he put on 40 ounces, and he specifically mentioned he used 3 pounds of AMS. AMS is important, but it sounds like he cleared that hurdle. He did the right thing. My next thought is, what about coverage? We've gotten along very well with glyphosate, and glufosinate does quite a bit the same thing, both broad spectrum grass and broadleaf products that need herbicide tolerant crops to work, but they work quite differently. And the way we use glyphosate doesn't necessarily work for the way we are going to use Liberty. Coverage is important, 15 gallons minimum, 20 is better. A lot of people have gone to these TTI nozzles that produce a pretty coarse drop because we like to use dicamba. We like those coarse drops. We want to avoid off-target movement. That's probably not the best for glufosinate or Liberty. Coverage is a little bit better. Those coarse drops probably aren't the best. I like to use the AIXR nozzles or what I call the old flat fan type nozzles, or what I use. The other thing about Liberty that I know, it does best in bright light. So avoid early morning or late afternoon, early evening type applications. When you can put it on in bright light, that's what makes it work best. And there's a couple of things it's weak on. One is lamb's quarters. In soybeans, you're going to have another lamb's quarters alternative, have something to supplement that. Usually soil applied is the best way to go. Lamb's quarter being a small seeded broadleaf, the soil applied products work pretty well on it. The other one that really rears up is yellow foxtail. Now we have a lot of foxtails, giant green, yellow, and of the three, yellow is the one that really comes out when we use glufosinate because it tillers very early. Glufosinate, being a contact type herbicide, does a good job of controlling the main growing point, but those tillers come out and we see a lot of that. So hope that helps, and good luck with using Liberty. I think it's going to be a product that hasn't had the attention it deserves over the years, but I think it has a fit in our corn and soybean cropping system.
Yeah, has been a good program, but yeah, it's not exactly the same as glyphosate, that's for sure. But I had another person was commenting too, wondering if cover crops are working better this year. I don't know if you have any comments about that, Greg, or anybody.
Well, I know our cover crop plots were the best I've ever seen them. They really, really did well. And I think, again, we had a nice environment last fall for getting those crops established and nice growing conditions this spring.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, had adequate moisture, and we certainly had moisture to get them established last year in the fall too. I have a question here. Any species of cover crop to help with IDC in beans, either seeded early spring or aerial seeded into corn the year before?
That's a good question.
I know George Ream had information about with oats. Didn't he talk about, I don't know if you remember that, Jeff, the work with oats?
Well, yeah, oat works well. The main thing, I think cereal rye would work. It's mostly about termination time. So you have to be careful when it comes to letting it grow too far. We found with oat, letting it grow to no more than 10 inches and then terminating was kind of the key. So with cereal rye, if you're trying to pull nitrate out, it should do it. We just have never tried it. So I think it'd be an interesting thing to look at to see if it would have the same impact of oat and if you could terminate it earlier and not have some of the issues with letting it go too far in the growing season.
Yeah, I'd add to what Dan said. What George Ream and Paul Bloom found was that it's that reduction of the nitrate in the profile is what helps minimize IDC in some of those soils, and that's kind of the key thing. So any grass cover crop that was left out there at least till spring would certainly have a huge impact.
Okay, well, we're getting a lot of cover crop questions here. How about any issues with terminating ARG, I'm assuming annual ryegrass that overwinters? Any have comments on that?
I haven't had an issue.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, and that, Axel Garcia at Lamberton would probably have a little more experience with some of those annual systems.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I don't know if Axel, if you can, well, let's see, I can unmute you. Axel, do you have any comments? You're unmuted now, so I'm warning you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Basically, we have not seen any issues with annual ryegrass, but yeah, we acknowledge that if there is something going on for the next year and we do not control, it might become an issue. So the thing is that most of the time, annual ryegrass is going to be winter killed. And if not, which we haven't seen it, we will be applying an herbicide very early in the season anyway. So when it's still very, very young, and it's pretty easy to control it, at least for conditions in this part of the world.
All right, thanks. And here's a question too. This is wondering about how late can you wait to terminate on soybeans, which is actually a project that we're looking at Lamberton. Just chiming over the timings acts about 9 days before planting, at planting, and then about 9 days after.
That is correct.
Yeah. Certainly get more biomass with the later termination, but you know, we're still collecting the data on that, but it certainly makes an impact on the amount of biomass produced.
Liz, is there an impact on weed suppression the longer you leave it go in soybeans?
Well, you know, again, that's something we haven't, you know, if you look at like organic systems in other states, yeah, you're going to get more biomass. You've got greater potential for having an impact on weed control. But, you know, we're just trying to see how much biomass we can get here in Minnesota. Of course, the concern is if you terminate it later, you know, could that potentially be a green bridge with diseases and insect pests? You know, how common are those pests though in our state? You know, that's, but again, it's all risk management, I guess. And then if you can't get out there, I mean, I have seen fields where somebody could not get out there, you know, they waited to terminate it, and then, you know, you end up getting a yield loss just because that cover crop competed so much with the cash crop, just because he couldn't get out there in a timely manner, and it can get tough to control.
Yeah, and I know, Jeff, too, this year, so we were targeting boot stage on rye to terminate, just regardless. And that boot stage was a couple of weeks ago, and we missed a lot of emergence. So it really wasn't having any impact at that point. And like Liz said, it's not providing us enough biomass to really put any sort of physical barrier on the soil surface. So yeah, we had to come back about 2 weeks after termination and clean it up. And I think we're going to have to go back again. But we are seeing some weed suppression of the really early emerging germinators like the common ragweed and giant ragweed in these systems that tend to hang around. So camelina, pennycress are sort of, they tend to hang in the system a little longer, not quite as competitive, and we have seen some suppression there.
Well, and I think that initial seeding rate too, because again, if you look at like learning from an organic system, a lot of times they're seeding at a higher rate with their cover crop than we might be in a conventional one, because they're maybe willing to have a little more competition than we might in a conventional system, just because their tools are more limited. So yeah, it's a good question. But with that, I think we've wrapped up all the questions that I see today. So yes, thanks everybody. Thanks for attending.
Liz?
Thanks to all our speakers. Oh, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, before everyone bolts here, I've got something if you don't mind if I share my screen. I've got some interesting pictures from our band versus broadcast potassium study that people might be interested in seeing. It'll take just a minute.
Okay, sure. Yep, we have people on here yet, so.
So this is a study that's funded by AFREC. And last year was kind of a setup year. This is the first key year of corn. And on the left, you'll see this was a 60 pounds of broadcast potassium or K2O as a muriate of potash 0060. And the soil test there for potash was 84 with the dry test, 44 with the moist test in part per million. So that would be low in both categories. Last year's soybean yield in this plot was 51 bushels. On the right is the same side-by-side split plot, but with a band application of the same rate and very similar soil tests. It was the same main plot. And what you see is a lot taller corn, a lot greener, darker corn, and you don't see those lower leaves with the potassium deficiency. So clearly in this example at Waseca, and we saw this in several plots, side-by-side comparisons, and also at the Rochester site, where this band application of potassium in these very low soil tests is superior to broadcast. Interestingly enough, we're also doing this in phosphorus with an adjacent study, and we're not seeing these differences in the phosphorus, but we are seeing in potassium. That's all I had.
Okay. Oh, great. Well, again, thanks everybody for sharing all your pictures. It's tough when we can't actually get out there and see the plots, but I'm glad that we could see them in another way. This was a nice compromise, since again, we're limited this year due to all the fun situations going on out there. So again, thanks everybody. And yeah, I'm sure any of our speakers too, if you do have any more questions, would be happy to address them if you wanted to send them an email in the future too, or give them a call. So, all right.
Thank you.